Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the ManageEngine Insights Fireside Chat series. Over the course of this series, we'll be interacting with a panel of eminent speakers from different domains of technology. I'm Priyanka Roy, an enterprise evangelist at ManageEngine, and I'll be your host for this series. Today, we're going to talk about enterprise AI and what benefits it holds for organizations. Over the last 50 years or so, AI has grown from a research-only discipline to an active component in organizations' digital strategy. However, the AI we see in our everyday lives is significantly different from enterprise AI. As organizations race to adopt AI in their environment, understanding what enterprise AI truly is and what it can offer can make a world of difference to the outcomes. The ability to successfully scale and employ enterprise AI is an organizational asset pivotal to the success of businesses of the future, no matter what industry they come from. During the course of today's Fireside Chat, we'll be taking an in-depth look at what is enterprise AI, how can organizations ensure the success of enterprise AI projects, and what the future holds for this. Joining us today, we have two award-winning AI experts who will be sharing their expertise on enterprise AI. The first speaker we have with us today is Dr. Lorien Pratt, Chief Scientist and Co-Founder at Quantellia LLC. Dr. Pratt has 3 decades of experience delivering applied AI, ML, and NLP solutions with a success rate over 7 times the industry average. Her clients include the Human Genome Project, SAP, the US Department of Energy, amongst others. She's a celebrated author of How Decision Intelligence Connects Data, Actions, and Outcomes for a Better World. And Dr. Pratt has appeared multiple times on NPR, has given 2 TEDx talks, and is a respected keynote speaker worldwide. Having led teams that invented transfer learning and decision intelligence, Dr. Pratt is recognized as a leading innovator by the Women Inventors and Innovators Project. We also have with us today Mr. Ramprakash Ramamoorthy, Product Director of AI and Machine Learning at Zoho Labs. Ramprakash has been leading the AI efforts at Zoho Corporation for the past 8 years. He kickstarted the AI efforts within the company and built the company's AI platform from scratch. A passionate leader with a level-headed approach to emerging technologies, Ramprakash takes a keen interest in causal AI, transfer learning, and privacy-preserving AI. So thank you so much, Lorien and Ramprakash, for joining us today. I really appreciate, you both taking out the time for this fireside chat. And I'm sure our audience will love to hear the insights that we get throughout this conversation. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. Very honored to be here.
Thank you. All right, then. So we'll just get straight to the questions. And I'm going to start with you, Lorien, if that's okay.
Sure.
So I think what we can start with, since, the topic of the conversation today is decoding the power of enterprise AI. What our audience would probably like to know first is, what is enterprise AI, and how is it different from AI used in other scenarios that we see in everyday use cases? So Lorien, if you could just shed a little bit of light on that.
Sure, that's a really great question, and I think it's a really important question because enterprise AI is quite different in several important ways from the AI that you might be familiar with. So I think most consumers are aware of AI in the sense that they get ads from Facebook or ads from Google, and I think they have a sense that maybe there's an AI behind that, and we could call that consumer AI. So that's an application that is delivered to a business, not to a business, but to just a regular human as not part of an organization. On the other hand, we should talk about business AI. And I see business AI really in kind of 3 separate categories. Number one, there's a lot of companies who've had tremendous success by using AI very much as part of their core business. Organizations like Amazon that gets 25% of their revenues from their collaborative filtering, where they recommend a book. They use AI in the background to do that. They also use AI for all kinds of things, like deciding, which accessories to recommend on your product that you might want to buy. The second kind of company are smaller firms that are trying to duplicate the experience of the Googles and the Amazons of the world. And enterprises, I think, are really a third business category Although we might also think about SMBs, right? Small and medium-sized businesses. I think the challenges we face in enterprise AI are really quite different because the decisions that the AI is supporting are very weighty. Sometimes if it's a government using AI, it could impact human lives. Banks that I work with, their AI decisions impact billions of dollars and lots of money. And so the requirements for sophistication and maturity of AI in these application areas is really quite different. So I just think of enterprise AI as the AI that's used by enterprises.
No, that makes sense, and I think it's very important to understand the difference between consumer-facing AI and AI for businesses, as you called it.
Yes.
So I think that's a great point to start with a clarification and a definition of thoughts for the podcast. So Ramprakash, I will move to the next question with you. When it comes to AI, do you think organizations, currently when it comes to AI, we see that organizations start and see success with small scale implementations for very point solutions, specific solutions. So how can this current practice that organizations are into, how can this be scaled up to an enterprise level?
Perfect. That's a great question, Priyanka. Thank you. So like Dr. Lorien said, we are looking at three kinds of organizations that generally have AI into their portfolio, and the adoption across these kind of organization varies. But there is always this fear of missing out on AI, just because of the way it's hyped so much in the media. And where do I get started? Or am I going to lose out because, or is my job going to be taken away, and things like that. But I think organizations need to have a very level-headed approach towards this newer technology, because it's like one of the other technologies that's going to make our lives easier. And generally, it's always very exciting to get on a proof of concept with AI, because you see that it's working with just the data you fed in, but integrating it at an overall level, at a holistic level, has a lot of challenges. One, because today's organizational data lives in silos. Right. So, for example, your sales guy would not be able to see your support data. Your support engineer would not be able to see your CRM data, and so on. And what AI needs is a 360-degree view of the data that you have got. So AI is something that subtly erodes all the data boundaries and needs a very high-level picture on the data you have, so that it can offer insightful decisions. So the first step is always to put AI into one place that is less impactful on your business. See how it behaves, because this AI is a very structural change. We have all built workflows around AI in our enterprise tools. So what was traditionally deterministic is going to be probabilistic, right? So 80% chance of an outage in a network monitoring system, then you have to amend your workflows in a different way. 40% chance of an outage, you have to do it differently, right? So this needs an attitude change towards a probabilistic workflow, and this has to be driven top down in the company. It's more of a cultural mindset change. So organizations should be braced to accept this change, and then that is when they will reap the real power of AI.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And is there anything you would like to add to this point, Lorien?
Yes, for sure. I think I love what you said about probabilistic workflows. So I'll really validate that. I think we do need to think about the workflows and the processes that AI fits into. And if we don't do that, we are going to see an increasing likelihood of AI failure, and AI failure absolutely does occur. I do want to draw a distinction between buying a software system that includes AI, maybe inside, and building your own AI from data. And I think we're really here, and Ramprakash, you can tell me if you agree, we're really talking about building your own AI models. If you're buying software that happens to have AI inside it, I think you evaluate that just like you'd evaluate any other vendor purchase. How well proven is it? How widely have they used it? What's the ROI on the purchase? I don't think there's anything unusual there. I think really what we're talking about is when you want to take that extra step and you want to take some data from inside your organization, as you say, in multiple silos, and then build your own AI models. And then I also think it's a good distinction to make between the three big pillars of AI, which is natural language processing, machine vision, and then machine learning. And the vast majority of applied machine learning is supervised deep learning. And so I think of supervised deep learning, NLP, and machine vision. And I think it's helpful to really think of those as quite distinct arenas. We lump them together as AI, but they really are starting to get quite unique algorithms between the three arenas.
Right. No, that makes sense. And, carrying on from that note, Lorien, the next question I would probably ask you is there a right time to adopt enterprise AI? Because we're talking about the distinction between opting for a solution which has inbuilt AI features as opposed to building your own AI models and solutions. So is there a right time when organizations should, adopt enterprise AI? And how do they decide, when is the right time? I
So
can see you smiling.
Ramprakash was right. It was yesterday, because otherwise you're going to miss out on everything.
Yeah.
I'm just joking, actually, because that is the messaging that is happening. AI uniquely among powerful new technologies has a big place in Hollywood. I mean, we didn't have big Hollywood telephone stories or big Hollywood, thresher or agriculture stories when new agriculture tech came out. But we do have stories of AI that I think add a tremendous amount of noise and hype. And because it's a complex technology, we have this sort of unique combination of all this hype and journalists who want to write about AI because it's great clickbait, but they don't really think very deeply about it. And so we do get this sense as an enterprise that yesterday was the time and we're going to miss out and we're in trouble if we haven't implemented AI yet. You better get with the program right now. I encourage a more thoughtful approach, right? And so I think it's a good idea to experiment with AI, because I think until you've built one application from your data, you're not going to have a good sense of what it's all about. So that's one sort of entry point that I see organizations doing. They do have this sort of fear of missing out. And so they say, let's pick an application that perhaps has a lot of success in AI. So like churn management, right? And churn is kind of the technical word for, measuring which of your customers you're about to lose. Very, very widespread, very successful. I did my first churn model in, I hate to say it, 1996, right? So churn models using machine learning have been around a long time. For instance, or pick something else that's been successful, do a small project, or buy AI, as we talked about, again, another low risk way to get into it. Or, if you really think that AI is going to be strategic to your organization, work diligently and think of AI as an engineering discipline and apply all of the great skills we have as software engineers, like software QA and requirements gathering. But then there are some special risks that come with AI too.
Thank you for clarifying those points, Lorien. Ramprakash, is there something that you would like to add to this? I mean, coming from an organization which has its own AI and ML research and development wing, is there anything that you would add to Lorien's points?
Perfect. So I think Dr. Lorien's point was comprehensive, and one thing I want to add is basically, like, let's say if you have a team of software engineers and you're already working on some aspect of software development, then I would say you go about building your AI. Let's say you're a company that does insurance and you have no experience building software tools, then don't get your hands wet with it. And even when you're building it, it's going to be an expensive affair. AI is going to be expensive just because of the tremendous amount of data you need for making your model working reasonably well. And of course, the compute again is going to be even more expensive, because what was used for video processing, what was used for gaming, now we are trying to repurpose them. I'm talking about GPUs. We are trying to repurpose them into compute for AI. So it's really going to be an expensive affair. And if you are investing in AI, then there are a lot of tricks and tips to actually get the right way. Because if you look at it, you should actually treat your data like code. A lot of organizations don't do it. They treat data and code separately. But we were able to ManageEngine, we were able to extract the best value out of AI when we started, versioning code, when we started creating branches on, when we started versioning data, when we started creating branches on data. The same GitHub concepts were applied onto data, and we were able to see that worked flawlessly. Right. So now let's say you're not a very, programmatically technical organization and you buy software. Then one advice I would give you is, do not go about looking for an AI vendor. Go about looking for a software vendor who offers AI capabilities, because AI is not something separate, right? It is something that is tightly connected with your existing software and data lakes and all the data repositories you have. So a good idea is to choose somebody who offers AI as a part of their spectrum, and somebody whose coverage in your organization is wider, right? So that it, like I said, it erodes data boundaries. Your AI model or the vendor's AI model has access to all the data you've been able to collect, because now is a point where digitalization is rampant, and it only makes sense if you're going to use all the collected data to your competitive advantage. So pick your choices wisely. Your mileage might vary. If you're going to build it on your own, take necessary precautions. If you're going to buy it, don't look for a fancy AI vendor. Look for a software vendor who has AI features. That would be my point.
That's great advice, Ramprakash. I think a lot of our audience will benefit from that advice. So Lorien, we'll move on to you next. Again, carrying on from that point, if organizations do choose to opt for building their own AI solutions, their own AI models, then how do they ensure the success of AI projects? Because we were just talking about how that more often than not, there are cases where the projects fail. So how are there any standard best practices that companies can learn from?
Yes, I think there's both classic mistakes that have been in AI. AI as a field has been around for 50 years. And so it's been very, very highly academic. And so most of the people who consider themselves AI experts will be folks who have been reinforced in their careers for publishing papers, inventing new algorithms, and getting really high performance out of their algorithms. Notice I didn't say using those algorithms to do something useful. In fact, if you submit a paper that's about applied AI or a practical application to the big AI conferences like NeurIPS, you'll get rejected. And by and large, right? Because the field has been very research focused. And so as we move forward and want to be successful, as you say, Priyanka, we actually need to go against some of those entrenched habits that we see that come from AI being academic. So the first thing I'll say is don't hire an AI expert. If you want to have people internally to your company, this is very similar to what Ramprakash just said, start with a good software engineer, right? So take your software engineers. And what's great about AI is all the best algorithms are free, available in open source, and there's fantastic tutorials these days. And the cost of learning this has really, really plummeted. And so we've really kind of hit this watershed where maybe 2 years ago, companies were paying, $750,000 US per year for an AI expert. These days, the successful companies that I work with are repurposing their software engineers and turning them into AI experts using those great, massive resources that are out there. So that's what I would say is number one. Number two, I'll teach you 2 words that I made up recently. One is solutionism and the other is data fetish. Solutionism is being really obsessed with having the coolest, latest, greatest algorithm. And you need to realize that because of what AI has been for so many years, most AI people think that unless you're using the most edgy, newest algorithm that's just published in NeurIPS, then you're not really doing good work. Whereas what I find is that companies who actually want to use AI to solve real problems often use the older algorithms. They're not always using the cutting edge stuff because they've been proven, they've been matured, no wine before it's time. So don't fall for solutionism, right? Which is you start with the cool, sexy solution. And the flip side of that is start with the problem, right? Understand the context. So Ramprakash was talking about workflows and knowing the processes in which your AI is going to fit. So I'll meet you and raise you, Ramprakash. I think that many AI systems fit inside not just workflow in general, but they support some decision that's going to be made. Either that's an automated decision like should I show an ad to somebody, or it's a human in the loop decision, like should I launch a new product feature, or where should I market my product? Should I do it in Chennai, or should I do it in Bangladesh, for instance? And both of those decisions tend to get ignored. The AI academic tradition does not embrace the idea of analyzing the decision that the AI is going to solve. But what's the point of an AI if it doesn't support some decision, right? But yet we tend to start with the solution and then work backwards to the problem. And this is what's continued to be taught in data science programs and AI programs. They don't teach what's the equivalent of software engineering, right? Remember when we were all coders, Ramprakash, and we didn't, do requirements, we didn't do good design, and then, our software all failed. And so the software industry, like every engineering industry, went through a transition where it grew up. We're not the Wright brothers flying an airplane. That's great. It's great to be edgy and do the new thing, but that's very different than running an airline. There's a lot of best practices that surround the new technology that enterprises are beginning to embrace, but are not very natural to the 50-year-old academic field of AI. And so there's just a couple of best practices and classic mistakes, as well as kind of where those best practices and classic mistakes tend to arise from, is because it's been such an academic field. We tend to think we can't be good AI people unless we're also doing AI research, and that is not true. The hard problems are not inventing yet another AI algorithm. The hard problem is taking the existing AI algorithms and doing the hard lifting work, the heavy lifting, boring, some people would say boring. I actually think it's pretty cool work of getting that AI embedded into an application such that it drives business value. Boy, Ramprakash, you're smiling. I think you like what I'm saying.
Yes. I just can't nod my head in agreeing to you, because both the things which you talked about, just last night, we were rejected from a very prestigious very prestigious conference.
Join the club. That's to your credit.
where we submitted an idea of how our how we scaled it to 1 billion calls per hour.
Yes.
Right. So our AI model, I'm not going to get into the details, but a very prestigious conference. And so yeah, I was like, did she read my inbox? And so that was one. And two is like you said, at ManageEngine Zoho Corp, this has worked actually. We hire software engineers and we just give them probably 10 days or max 20 days, and then they become the best of AI/ML experts that we have ever seen. And yes. In fact, we have a apprenticeship program called Zoho Schools, where we pick kids out of high school and give them some 6 months of training. And today around 30% of our AI development team is from the Zoho Schools. They don't have any formal degrees. Absolutely, they're not PhDs. They were just picked out of high school. We trained them for 4 to 6 months, and then they are on the job now. They are pretty much like all of us. They write production code. They're able to scale it up. They add new features. They're able to handle customer support, and then they also publish papers and patents. So, like you said, AI is right for software engineers, and I've seen the other side also, because it's very difficult to teach programming to an AI expert, to teach operating systems to an AI expert. So we have always stuck to hiring software engineers and letting them build our AI systems, and that has worked. You just spoke my mind.
Yeah. I like to think I organized the NIPS conference years ago, and I was on the program committee as well. So I like to say that I could speak with some knowledge there. I'm not just bashing them. It's a wonderful conference, as are all the AI research conferences out there, but they have their place. And we are at a turning point in this industry where it is maturing, and we're beginning to see conferences that really do embrace the challenge of getting these AI systems into applications. And I teach a course that's a day and a half, and I take software engineers and I turn them into machine learning experts. So like I curate the giant internet of all the AI out there down to like 4 Jupyter notebooks, and that's all you need to know to be, get 80%, 85% to be an effective AI and machine learning engineer. And so I really applaud that you're taking that approach. It's very different than really everybody said was what you were supposed to do years back. And what that came from is, companies like Google and Amazon, who were the early adopters. But of course, the behavior of the early adopters is going to be quite different as the field matures and goes much more broadly into enterprises and other kinds of organizations. So good for you. I love that you're doing that. That's so awesome.
Thank you so much, Lorien and Ramprakash. I think there were some great points that we both raised there, because AI has been seeing so much hype of late. I feel many organizations just feel the the urge to jump on the bandwagon just so that they can say, oh, we have AI. But a more conservative and thoughtful, well thought out process, I think, is what is the need of the hour. So we took a look at the best practices that organizations can learn from when embarking on an AI project. Ramprakash, can you shed some light on the most common pitfalls that organizations face when they try and adopt AI? So, and how can they possibly avoid these pitfalls?
Perfect. So I think the first step is to set your expectations right, because all we hear about AI is cancer cures and self-driving cars, but
not
at ManageEngine, when we launched our first AI feature, the team worked on it for almost 6 to 8 months, and then we launched it. We were waiting for feedback. We were continuously refreshing our inboxes, and then after 2 weeks of launch, there came in the first ticket saying, "Hey, how do I turn this off?" Right? So the team was very disappointed. And interestingly, during the same time, there was another pet project which we didn't even consider as a major AI project that was launched. It was launched in our no-code platform, Zoho Creator. And it was a very, very small feature. It was done as a very fun experiment, and we kind of shipped it out. And all it would do was, whenever you name a form, it's going to recommend you the relevant icons. Right. So let's say you have a patient admission form, then it will probably recommend you an ambulance symbol or the doctor's logo and things like that. So there was a particular customer who got very excited because he has named his form as California Leads form, and then we have recommended the Golden Gate bridge icon. Right. So this guy wrote a very big appreciation email. It is those small things, right? Have AI into your everyday workflows. Don't expect AI to, now let's say you're a bank, probably just don't put AI into your credit system already, right? Put AI into your lead processing system, put AI into your support system, see how it works, see where it does not work. In fact, we recommend a technique called shadow AI. Let's say you're a bank and you want to offer credit, and in fact, you should already have a traditional system in place, a deterministic system in place, where a bank manager is going to vet the loan application, see if the person would repay it or not, and run it parallelly. Run your AI system parallelly, run the human system parallelly, and see where your strengths are. For example, in the case of bank, if you're able to identify a 85% match with the human and the AI systems in, let's say, an urban salaried class loan applicant, versus, let's say, a rural non-salaried class loan applicant, your human decision and AI decision doesn't match. So probably just go ahead, have a face-by-face implementation, automate all your urban salaried class applications with AI, and then see where your model goes wrong. Just try and tweak. Again, if you're building this on your own, have your engineers do it, or if you're buying it from a vendor, then pass on the feedback. Tell them that this area is where this AI tool is not performing well. There are ways to amend it. And generally, the other recommendation, I know Lorien can talk a lot about transfer learning, because she is the it is right only if she talks about it, but we are doing transfer learning in a lot of places where we try to bootstrap our AI models from publicly available data. We might have very limited data, but we try to bootstrap it from publicly available data. So embracing such techniques and understanding where AI can help and where it cannot help is going to be very important and crucial for your AI strategy.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ramprakash. And Lorien, we cannot possibly move on to the next question without hearing your inputs for this one.
Well,
so
let me jump. Yeah,
Yeah.
so let me jump off of what Ramprakash said, where you said you're running AI in shadow in parallel. And that reminded me of a best practice, which is also a classic mistake. The classic mistake is to think that AI always has to be a fully automated process. Whereas as we start to move into applications, often it's not just shadow AI for a while, but it's shadow AI always, right? So the AI, a lot of the cancer machine vision AI systems, the AI takes maybe 100,000 pictures that might have cancer in them, and it narrows them down and it says, I'm sure that these, 90,000 don't have pictures, and these other 10,000, I would like a human to look at that. And so there's sort of this balance. There's an optimal balance in any use case between how much is automated and how much there's a human in the loop. And so in your shadow AI example, Ramprakash, your credit analyst at the bank, it might be in some circumstances optimal for them to keep that as an advisory system and not ever to use the AI as to make the decision, but always to have it as an upstream filter or as an advisor. Certainly in HR applications, we'd like to have a human in the loop. So I think that's a classic mistake that we make because of so many of the early AI systems were fully automated. We tend to think that's how it always has to be, but often there's a balance. There's a human in the loop, kind of a human versus automation balance. So I think that's one best practice. The other thing that is really my big one, and if you guys remember nothing else out of this video, this is the one I'd like to really hit you with, because I've been delivering AI systems for like 30 years and hundreds. I would say at least half of my clients have made the following mistake, which is to spend too much time on the data before they build their first AI model. And that sort of made sense in the past because building the AI system was expensive. And so you want to make sure you don't start building the AI system until the data is cleansed and governed and as great as it possibly can be. But what we learn when we do a good variable importance analysis is that 10% of the data has 90% of the predictive power in a supervised learning application, at least. And if that's true, and we haven't tested that, and we don't know which is the 10 and which is the 90, we're going to be doing 9 times more work cleansing our data than we have to. And so my advice is not to spend a huge amount of time getting your data perfect, not to do all those joins with all those tables, right? But to get a small data set and run it through your AI system. First of all, your performance might be good enough, right? Because even though it might not get you into a conference or win a Kaggle competition, your performance might be good enough to drive a huge amount of business value with a small amount of data. And number two, if you run a variable importances analysis, that'll tell you the 10% of the data that has the most predictive power. And then you can turn around and do your cleansing on that data. And the data vendors don't want me to say this, right? This is where the hype comes from, because the data vendors want you to buy data appliances and data transmission things. And this really goes against their business model. And it kind of is where a lot of the hype came from, is we had, and I was one of them, I'm guilty of this. I was a journalist and I had vendors who would pitch to me and I would report their story about how great their data appliances were. And I certainly talked about big data, but it actually turns out that a lot of great AI systems, not so much machine vision. Machine vision, you usually need lots of data, but supervised learning and a lot of other business applications can actually get huge amounts of business value with a small amount of data, both in terms of rows, but what I was just talking about is columns, fewer features, the 10% of the columns that have 90% of the predictive power.
Thank you so much for that, Lorien. I think that's a very interesting suggestion and a very interesting perspective that you don't get to hear often. And since we are talking about data and clean data and data governance and all, my next question would be to you, Ramprakash, that what aspects of AI, enterprise AI, pose the biggest challenges to data privacy, and how can organizations address these? Because there's been a huge outcry about data privacy and maintaining data privacy of late. So while enterprise AI definitely has its advantages, we also have to keep the data privacy threats in mind. So what are the biggest threats to data privacy and how can they be addressed? And as a final question to that point, is there a way in which organizations can balance maintaining data privacy and economic competitiveness when embarking on the enterprise AI projects.
Perfect. So I think your economic competitiveness does not come at the cost of data privacy, right? So we are moving into a future where data privacy is going to be the first and foremost thing which consumers are going to prefer. And let us take the example of Apple, right? So privacy is their first marketing point today, right? But interestingly, if you just look back, let's say 10 years back, and if you have seen, not 10 years, if you look at AI's history from around the 1960s, it has had its share of up and downs, right? There are AI summers and then there are AI winters. And generally, this AI summer that particularly kicked off somewhere around 2011, 2012, one aspect we could see is, one is the power of cloud, where you have near infinite computing power. Two is your cheaper data collection sensors, right? Almost all of us wear a smartwatch where our heart rate is recorded every 5 minutes, oxygen saturation every 20 minutes, the number of steps you take. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And it's an Apple for exactly that reason. I used to have another smartwatch that was not as respectful of privacy.
Perfect. Yeah. So if we have cheaper data collection capabilities, and the third point is, a lot of companies have successfully built business models around data, right? So we don't pay for search engines, we don't pay for social networks. Instead, we just share our personal data, and then they've built very successful $1 trillion business models around our personal data.
Yes.
Right now, that is going to see a change, because what worked in the consumer world is not going to work in the enterprise world, because we are hearing things like adjunct surveillance, right? Where you don't want your business secrets on your software vendor to be extracted and showed as an ad to your competitor, right? You never don't want that to happen. So economic competitiveness is never going to come from the level of data privacy that you have. Data privacy is your first and foremost, and any issues with your privacy aspects is going to cause you a huge reputational loss, which is very difficult to fill. Forget monetary loss, but the reputational loss is a huge gap which you probably never are going to fill in the organization's lifetime. So I would say it's always important to take care of your the data that flows through your AI system, because there are other things. Let's say when you leak personally identifiable information into your AI models, then probably they start becoming biased. We read a lot about the hiring systems, recruiting systems, identifying candidates by their ethnicity, by their gender, and then not screening them appropriately. So like Lorien said in the last point, I want to re-emphasize that, right? Do not think of AI as complete automation. Do not let AI do your recruitment. Do not let AI do your loan credit processing. Instead, have a human in the loop. It's going to maximize the value of both the human and the AI system. One example I could think of is during the onset of the pandemic, we had a network management system that actually stopped letting in valid request and identified it as a denial of service attack and stopped letting in valid users. But in fact, actually, the WHO declared it as a pandemic, declared COVID-19 as a pandemic, and lockdown, stay-at-home things were announced, and people were just stocking toilet papers, right? It was an online grocer in London, actually. And you see that the model was not trained on any pandemic data. It probably didn't know why people were buying 3 months of toilet paper in a matter of a week. So if there were a human in the loop who actually read the news, or who was actually looking at his Twitter feed or his Facebook feed, then probably you know what is happening, and it will bypass the DDoS warning from the system. So never go fully autonomous. Okay, coming back to our privacy again, there are a lot of things, not just direct PII, direct personally identifiable information. There are a lot of indirect PIIs. A person of this particular region, probably living in this area, then you can probably get his age, you can probably get his religion, you can probably get his ethnicity, and so on. So it is important to treat your data with utmost care. Do not let any PII leak into the system. And this is everywhere, right? When I talk about bias, it's not only in the recruitment systems, it's also in your IT service delivery management, right? You need to make sure you're not passing on your biases to your AI model. That is going to be very important, and have privacy as your first checkpoint, only access data that you have permission to access, and write your privacy terms in plain English so that it is easier for the end user to understand. That would be my point.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great advice, Ramprakash. Lorien, is there anything you would like to add to these points? What's your take on, ethical AI and privacy-centric, privacy-preserving AI?
Sure. Just gluing together two things that we just said. If 10% of the data has 90% of the predictive power, and you do the analysis and use that cool trick to reduce your data cleansing effort, it also impacts privacy, right? Because you're not using every single field about a person to feed through your AI system. Instead, you're feeding through that 10% that has the best predictive power. And you could sort of argue that that's the best of both worlds, right? As you get your best business value out of it, while at the same time reducing privacy impact because you have less attributes about the person or the company that you're doing, and also less cost because you have less data wrangling work that you have to do if you reduce it. So this one trick of just doing a ranked variable importances after you, and it's a technical thing, but all it means is it says, oh, I'm trying to predict whether Ramprakash is going to buy my hot dogs. I'm going to say, well, what determines that is what city he lives in and his zip code, but the color of his hair won't be predictive, right? It's just like making a list of all the things that could predict that, and then narrowing down on the things that are actually predictive. So that's thing number one, is that same trick can help with privacy. The other thing I wanted to say is about bias, and this goes to kind of a classic mistake. I think a lot of organizations, again, it goes back to the academic. There's so much academic research on bias these days, and justifiably so. Bias is really important, but it's really easy to measure. Just take a subset of your data that has a minority population, like it's African American people or Latinx people or low income people, and do an analysis of that, cross-validation, and see the performance of your system on that disadvantaged minority. I mean, you can get 90% of the value out of, bias analysis without any fancy algorithms. Just instead of analyzing the performance of your system on all classes of people or all classes of companies, analyze it separately on these disadvantaged groups that you have a hypothesis that might have some bias in them. And it's only 40% accurate on Latin American people, and it's 92% accurate on white men over 55. Okay, that's all you need to do. And so overthinking bias is the other classic mistake that I see a lot of organizations do. And by the way, overthinking explainability too, because just giving that list of those top variable importances is often all you really need to feel satisfied that you've understood what your machine learning or AI system is doing. So there you get three classic mistakes and best practices out of me there.
Right. No, thank you very much. I think what is important is companies in the first place, they need to be cognizant of this problem. I mean, unless and until they know that a problem like this exists, only then do they, do the step that you said, take the minority data and, run the algorithm of that. And of course, they have to be willing to go, the extra step to, ensure that there are no biases. But
it's not hard. I mean, that's the point, is once you decide to do it, it's super easy. And I think if you talk to a typical machine learning expert, they'll hit you with 20 different fancy algorithms for that, most of which, if you can do the basic thing, you don't really need.
Thank you for that. That's great advice. So I think we are kind of nearing the end of our fireside chat today. So for the final question of our conversation, we're going to wrap it up with a question to you, Lorien. What is the future of enterprise AI? When you think about it, where do you see enterprise AI in the next 5 years?
So we've already alluded to the first big future trend, which is AI is going to shift from an academic discipline, a research science, to an engineering discipline. And so we're going to bring in all the great best practices that we know from engineering, like quality assurance, like good testing. And we've spoken to that extensively, so I'll just leave it at that. What I'm really excited about is the new field of decision intelligence, which is bridging a gap. I conducted about 300 interviews about 10 years ago, and I said, what's missing from technology? What should technology do that it's not doing for you? And they said, it's not really helping me make decisions. And so despite all the successes that we see in AI, if we talk to leaders in government organizations, large enterprises, AI, data, even evidence doesn't really cross their radar. They're still making multi-trillion-dollar decisions in some cases, and I don't know, pandemic decisions without the benefit of this kind of technology, right? I mean, AI didn't help much with COVID. I mean, we had some machine learning predictors, but what we really needed to do with COVID was to say, for me, given my situation, should I wear a mask? Should I lock down? And a lot of those decisions were done without a really deep evidence base. And so there's this gap between hard, complex problems like COVID, like climate, like poverty, like inequality, like the $500 million project, which was my first big decision intelligence project at a very large bank, where they just had what was it, 50 countries and 10,000 projects that they needed to coordinate, these massively complex situations. And AI isn't touching those, right? And so I invented with my co-founder decision intelligence around 2009, 2010. We called it decision engineering, and then we renamed it. And I'm happy to say 10 years later, Gartner's tracking it on their hype cycle, have been for a couple of years. And it's been featured on Forbes and C-SPAN. And it really is just the science of getting those decisions that people are making and structuring them in such a way that we can plug in AI and data and evidence, but not lose human expertise. So it also speaks to what we were talking about earlier, which is those human in the loop, AI amplification kinds of situations, or intelligence amplification situations. Turn AI upside down and get IA. So to me, and that's been really exciting to invent. I invented transfer, and now I'm inventing decision intelligence, and it's taken off. There's companies that have 9-figure Series B rounds that are decision intelligence companies, and Google's trained 20,000 people in decision intelligence. So that's to me the really exciting future of AI. It's kind of this layer above AI that orchestrates multiple models together and also connects them to humans.
Right. That sounds very fancy, and
it's very fancy.
Congratulations for having it take off so well. Ramprakash, what's your take on this? What's your take on what the future is going to hold for enterprise AI?
Well, I would definitely concur to what Dr. Lorien said, and we are moving from process automation to decision automation. So decision intelligence is going to be the next big thing that organizations need to tap into. It might not have a precursor in the consumer world, but in the enterprise world, it's going to make a sea of changes in the way we produce and consume data, in the way we use our software techniques, in the way software is going to aid humans to take better decisions. So I'm very optimistic and very bullish about how AI is going to change the way we work.
Can I add to that a little bit? We've been working with one of the sovereign banks of a G20 nation, and what we've realized is that Harvard Business Review calls the modern organization a decision factory. And if you think about that, we really are producing decisions. That's what the knowledge economy is all about. We're not manufacturing cars. I mean, we still are, but so many organizations are much more about using knowledge to generate decisions. Well, what made traditional factories jump into the digital age was ERP, enterprise resource planning, which was tracking digitally all of the stuff, all the nuts and bolts and paint that goes into making something. And I think decision intelligence is kind of the ERP of the modern organization. It's a way of saying, yes, we're all making decisions, but nobody has a way of drawing a picture of those decisions. Nobody has a way of integrating those decisions with evidence and data and with endpoints and managing those endpoints, right? That might have a model on the endpoint or might have some data on the endpoint. And so I think what we're going to see is organizations, as a software engineer, I sort of see it as all these decision modules, right? With well-defined interfaces and contracts from one to the next. And the decision modules inside them will have humans that are helping with the decision and using their knowledge of the causal knowledge of the world, which AI really doesn't know very well yet. They'll also have some data, they'll also have simulation. And so just like a pilot uses a simulator to learn to fly a plane, we'll use simulators to learn what to do about COVID or climate, and we'll play out all kinds of scenarios for, if I make this decision in this scenario, what will the result be? And I think future organizations are going to be much more formalized as decision factories instead of what we see today as a very informal decision factory.
That sounds and looks like a very exciting future for AI. I, for one, am very interested to see where it goes. So thank you so much, Lorien and Ramprakash, for joining us today. I think there were some great points, great advice and suggestions that both of you provided during the last an hour or so. And I think we can safely say that our audience will better understand how to approach AI, enterprise AI, thanks to our insightful conversation today. And that brings us to an end to this first episode of our ManageEngine Insights Fireside Chat. And thank you again, both of you, very, very much for your time today.
Thank you, Priyanka. And thank you to
you.
the audience for your time.
Thank you. And just as closing statements, thank you everybody for tuning in. If you have any feedback or questions for us, please leave them in the comment section and we'll get back to you at the earliest. And please stay tuned for our next episode of our Fireside Chat series.